Good morning, everyone. I hope you're well on this beautiful blue-skied Tuesday morning. Welcome to Data Day 8.0. I'm very, very happy to be your moderator today. My name is Tracy Lorio from the School of Journalism and Communication, and we're going to have a wonderful fireside chat on the topic of trust and ethics in AI, automation, blockchain, and data analytics from a government, private sector, and a legal perspective. I fortunately was supported in organizing this panel by Dr. Gordana Teshik from Shopify, and I will introduce the panelists who will each have a few moments to introduce themselves, to speak about their role in their organizations and how they understand trust, and then we'll take it from there. We absolutely welcome your questions for the session, so please put them into the Q&A, and I'll be sure to try and adjust them when we get to that particular time. Without further ado, let me start introducing our panelists for today. So we are going to start off today with we said we'd get away with all of these titles, but with Wendy Foster, who's the Director of Engineering and Data Science at Shopify. Welcome, Wendy. With Florian Martin Barito, the Director of the Center for Technology, Law and Policy at the University of Ottawa. Welcome, Florian. With Amy Bihari, the Senior Manager of Data Teams and Trustworthy AI in the Government of Ontario. Welcome, Amy. As well as Var Shankar, the Senior Manager of the Responsible AI Institute. I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. The reason for organizing this panel on trust is it's a very important topic at this very point in time globally. Is it trust in our institutions, trust in our governments, trust in what we hear in terms of social media, but that's not necessarily the topic for today. Do we trust the automation of systems? Do we trust the data that are going into these systems? Do we trust the institutions that are procuring and deploying these types of systems? And what are the different understandings of trust when it comes to AI and automation? I'm really looking forward to hearing from you and hearing from your questions. And without further ado, Wendy, how about you get us started?
Thanks, Tracy. Got a little technical glitch there. I'm really excited to be here and participating in this fireside chat with everybody today. As Tracy said, I'm a Director of Engineering and Data Science at Shopify. And for folks of you who don't know, Shopify is an e-commerce platform and set of services that allows entrepreneurs to build and grow their online businesses intuitively. So for Shopify, I'd suggest we strategically engage the machine learning space as opposed to that broader AI umbrella. And we deploy machine learning for both internal as well as external use cases. So to give you a little bit of an idea about what that means, externally, merchants who use our platform often develop complex operational workflows to help run and manage their businesses. So strategic machine learning in merchant-facing products can reduce workflow toil, help merchants make informed and hopefully better decisions for their business. And it's not so much different for how we use machine learning internally as well. So we use machine learning algorithms to help us understand our business better, support product and business planning and prioritization. Think of it essentially as decision science. And when I think about trust in general, for me, whether we're discussing AI or something else, trust is really a relationship that's grounded in reliability, consistency, and transparency. And trust is something that's really built over time. And that for me is by meeting expectations. So when I think of it from a business sense, like meeting those expectations repeatedly across the dimensions I mentioned, both partners in that relationship begin to understand the what and the why of an action. And I think most importantly, we can agree on the outcomes. And that agreement on the outcomes to me is the core of trust for machine learning applications or otherwise. And in AI in particular, trust is paramount because the how of that algorithm is often black boxed or impenetrable to the end user. So even the best explanatory processes are often not easily engageable by end users. We know how complicated like some of these technologies can be. And when I think about how we create applications, user-facing applications for those algorithms, we often see that some of those applications lack even the most basic of feedback mechanisms that allow that world, that end user, that human, as part of our like bilateral relationship impacted by our machine learning algorithm to interact with it, right? And so trust, I start to see it as being built at the application layer, and that I'm sure for other folks on like this panel, there'll be dimensions to that relationship that they'll be able to pull out more complexly as well. Tracy, did you want me to say something else?
Hi, sorry about that. There seems to be a little disconnect with a few things. We're the first panel, so that often happens. Thank you very much, Wendy. We'll move on now over to Florian, and then we'll come back to you once everybody has done a round table. Thank you so much, and thanks for being patient with these little glitches. Over to you, Florian.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Wonderful.
Awesome. So first, thank you so much for the invitation this morning. And so as Tracy mentioned in the introduction, I'm a professor at the University of Ottawa, where I lead the Center for Law, Technology, and Society. And we're a big research center within in Canada. We're the premier Canadian research hub for technology, law, ethics, and policy. We're like one of the global leaders in those conversations, and not for AI and blockchain, but we haven't been in the space for like 2 or 3 years since AI and blockchain and technology has been like hype. We have been leading those kind of conversation for like 20 years. So way back in the day, at the beginning of the internet, when it was not yet what the internet is today. And so we research, analyze, and shed the light on the very complex and independent relationships, between technology, law, policy, society in an interdisciplinary setting. So we have we're born from the law school, but we have professors in engineering, in philosophy, in communication. So trying to bring different perspective to think about policy. We're not so much on the development side, but more like on the policy framework and making sure, when we think of trust, like how can citizen, trust systems that are deployed in society, that are deployed by our government. I'm sure we're going to discuss this with some of our panelists. So we're more like policy oriented, working with stakeholders. For example, if we look at agri-tech and food tech, working with farmers in Ontario to see how data is used in the private sector, but also in government to maybe inform more or less in a good way policy making. And we try to produce a lot of output to inform both the scholarly debate, but also policy making, and more generally the public. A lot of our outputs have a more like educational lens, for example, on AI, trust in educational technologies and the use of AI maybe for surveillance vis-a-vis students, etc. In universities, in schools. We just produced a short movie with some of our postdoc fellows. So that kind of things, and I will mention this because I know that Tracy is a big fan of them. We have a legal clinic, CPIC, the Samuelson Glushko Canadian
Internet Policy Interest Clinic. It took me many years, Florian, to memorize it.
I don't know why. I just blanked. Who has been
all the time.
Yeah, so has been like very involved in all policy debate and in all level of courts in Canada to make sure that we have digital rights, that we have privacy against some of the big platforms, that our contract with Facebook, Uber, etc., are not used to shut us down and to remove our access to justice and some other fundamental rights. So this is what we're working on, and so obviously trust is something we're working on. Trust in policy framework, trust in technology, and trust is very important for adoption. AI can bring many amazing benefits for our societies in many fields, including healthcare, for example, but it can also amplify injustices, disparities. So there is like the good and the bad, and we need to make sure that we have the legal frameworks. I'm sure we're going to discuss a lot about ethics and trust, but guidelines are very nice. But at the end of the day, if we want, there is a few industry leaders or like actually doing this, but if we want most of the industry actors to actually protect fundamental rights and don't amplify injustices and bias, etc., we need to have the proper legal framework to frame this. And so this is what we're working on, like how policy frameworks, legal framework can support trust. And when someone doesn't promote responsible development of technology, how can we make sure that they're gonna be sanctioned or fined? Because this is the only thing, sadly, that people and industry will understand. So in a nutshell, this is what we've been working on for quite some time now.
Wonderful. Thank you, Florian. And thank you for little pointers on legal frameworks and guidelines, and we'll continue that discussion afterwards. Amy, over to you.
Hi, good morning. Thanks for having me. I am Amy Bahari. I work in the Ontario government. So I guess we've heard a little bit from Florian and Wendy about like the applications and the optimism around AI is where I like to come in, and the optimism around the use of data, the reuse of data. So where I am within government is sort of in the center, and I lead the teams that are the connective tissue of the data practitioners, the policy writers, the framework developers, the ones who are creating the data, sharing the data, integrating the data, finding new ways to use it. My team has been steeped within open government as well. So trust is a big piece to us. Here in Ontario, a lot of the movement that we've been doing within open data, within emerging tech, within responsible, trustworthy AI has been rooted in the ideas of co-creation and the ideas of bringing people into government. And that's where I really see this rub of trust, is it is about the people. It isn't a product or a piece of a product or a service. It is how humans interact with other humans, and data or the services are just part of the conversation, the channel or the language that's being used at the time. And so also when I think about trust, it isn't just about how we foster it with our end users, but from where my teams sit, the collection and the flow and then the use and then the reuse of data, there are tiny little micro transactions of trust that have to be built and maintained. Trust isn't something that just automatically happens because you've said the right words or you've come in at the right time. It really is about the relationships. And so how the data comes in and whether we're going to share it or how we're going to share it or how we're going to reuse it. And as Florian said, the rules, the guidelines. I like to sort of think more about compasses putting in place. Do I have this shared idea of what direction are we heading in? Because the details of the map can shift so drastically. And especially when we talk about data and AI, things move at such a speed that it is hard for us to maintain trust or to see the big patterns within a relationship, which is really what trust is rooted in. My team has been very busy in the last 2 years, really seeing how a lot of this collection, the idea of open data, of sharing and the reuse of data, the power of what AI can bring, what does that look like in a time of crisis, of we need to look to each other and to what is really happening on and to trust and to truth and what that might mean in the moment within this pandemic. And so I think it's really allowed us to have some very excellent case studies to really look at what these ideas and principles that we've talked a lot around trust building, co-creation, the value of data, the value of public good, public health, those types of things. It's really allowed us to have some tangible case studies that we can all build forward on. And that's something I'm really excited about. But I just see it as a wild, wonderful world of sometimes spaghetti. But here within data, there's so many different avenues and there's so many different people doing some really wonderful things. And how do we help each other? How do we continue to grow that connective tissue? Like I said, that's what my teams tend to be, between the practitioners, the service providers, the product builders, the app builders, the policy builders. And then how do we work with those who are impacted by these services, these products, these pieces of legislation? So how do we keep that conversation going? Because for me, that's where trust is. It is on an ongoing conversation where we all have a spot, we all have a voice, and we can all build together. It is that idea of co-creation and working together.
Thanks so much. Thank you so much, Amy. I feel better in government already just talking to you this morning. So you brought my internal, you started the day with direct optimism. So thank you very much for that. Now over to Var, please. Good morning, Var.
Hi, good morning. Yeah, so thank you, Tracy, and thank you for to the organizers for bringing us together for this important discussion. So my name is Var. I am a lawyer by background and a co-developer of the Intro to AI Ethics course at Kaggle. I've also worked on digital government issues with the government of British Columbia, including during COVID response. And so I'm passionate about the same sorts of issues that Amy just talked about. I'm currently with the Responsible AI Institute, which is an Austin-based nonprofit that advances the adoption of trusted and trustworthy AI. Our executive director, Ashley Cassavan, previously led the development of Canada's Directive on Automated Decision Making, which, as many of us know, is the first such major government directive in the world. And she started this organization to have a broader impact across industries, government, as well as in the EU, UK, Canada, US, and elsewhere. So our effort has been to close the gaps between AI in practice, so as practiced by organizations adopting AI, and then policy research, policy makers, and AI ML research that's relevant to specific intersections. So just make sure all those different groups are talking to each other and sharing their best practices in a way that is documented and auditable. So to do so, we started by mapping all the different AI principles and standard documents from the OECD, UNESCO, the EU, and other organizations to inform our implementation framework for responsible AI. And on an ongoing basis, we work with our community to calibrate the implementation framework for each of our use cases. And that's really important to us, being focused and grounded in really specific use cases, because context is very important when it comes to AI adoption. So with regard to trusted AI, I think some of the issues that the other panelists touched upon in their introductions are I feel like we've kind of touched upon most of the broad buckets. So I'll just say that in addition to all the pieces, in addition to policy, in addition to developing a certification, which is what our organization is eventually working toward, and in addition to kind of the process-based interventions throughout the AI development lifecycle within organizations, trust is also about institutions, and as we know, trust in our institutions has been declining in recent years. Restoring that trust is already difficult. And so part of the reason that I'm passionate about this work is how our policymakers respond to AI is kind of an important test for effective governance as well. So thanks again for having me and really interested in this discussion.
Thank you very much. And now all the panelists are going to come in together. So let's see how this all works out for us. And while that is happening, VAR, everybody's popping in. Can you tell us a little bit about how you understand the concept of trust? Because you've told us what you do, and you've told us a little bit about public policy and institutions. We'll come back to talking about the certification afterwards, but can you tell us a little bit how you conceptualize trust, how you understand trust?
Yeah, so I think that there's two elements that I kind of touched upon earlier, which are being trusted and being trustworthy. And being trusted is you can have trust in an institution or a product that's not trustworthy, and vice versa. And there's kind of pros and cons that researchers study to each of those things. I think our effort is to be both, and I think that maybe the approach to get there is to recognize that there's a role for everybody to play. So those checks and balances are very important. So all the way from as Florian mentioned, like the laws and policies, corporate policies, and then kind of standards, best practices, certifications. That's the field that my organization is in, and then all the way to kind of the actual functional level where you have data scientists, auditors, legal teams, and so just making sure that there's a role for everybody, everybody speaking the same language and working towards the same goal. That's how I think a system can be both trusted and trustworthy.
Thanks very much. I'll come back and to you, Wendy. So you had introduced at the very beginning that one of the things that's important is a framework, and also being able to foster trust with citizens. So since you're the private sector rep in a way for all the private sector of all over the world in Canada, not true, but you are you are in the private sector. You're in an organization that Canadians love because you're right downtown here in Ottawa, and your organization has stayed here in Canada, which is very, very nice. So maybe you could tell us a little bit of what you mean in terms of a framework of trust. And if there were certification in the context of, let's say, what VAR is talking about, he didn't tell us what kind of certification and what that means. We'll come back to him on that. How would that work for you? Or would you prefer instead, getting certification and maybe a badge and or a legal framework or regulation? And I see that Florian would be interested in maybe popping in and talking about that afterwards.
Yeah. Bring me back to the first part of like the question, then I'll talk about how we engage with regulation and certification as well, because I think that is not unfamiliar in terms of data privacy and security and data governance holistically within private sector organizations, as well as clearly like an active area being motivated currently in public sector. So first part of your question, could you repeat, please?
Framework. So a framework, so a trusted policy framework is what you were discussing, as well as that citizens need to trust organizations. And so how would a policy framework within Shopify foster trust with citizens and perhaps consumers of your products and users of your platform?
Yeah, I think I'm with Florian here. I'm like, does it? Right? Because I mean, like internally, when we're developing machine learning applications and at Shopify, we're incredibly strategic about it. Our mission is around merchant success. So we don't apply machine learning solutions everywhere, only in places where we think we can significantly like reduce toil in some of those operational workflows that I talked about. But we do internally have a checklist that when you're developing machine learning applications, you can ensure you have top of mind oversight into like how we're both acquiring data, how we're like transforming it, and how we want to be able to use it in an end user application, whether that's in aggregate or for personalized experiences. But checklists, I think, as we've talked about internally, and Guardano might have like a perspective here as well. It's how do we have them for like engineering too? What am I trying to say here? Checklists like give you things to check off, right? In like when you're commit or when you're building. But really what's important to us at Shopify is actually developing the culture around how we think deeply and complexly about the experiences we're building for our end users, which are our merchants and who are central to all of our decision making, right? So the checklist, I think, is like useful to a certain extent, but it's also fairly anemic, right? So we have like internal working groups around machine learning ethics. Those are active and ongoing conversations led by people who've worked in the field. Gordana is like one of them, who help us build the culture of responsible AI or machine learning that we want to be embedded in all of our decisions around machine learning applications within the organization. So, as I said, like checklists are like one way, but really having like teams be thinking deeply about how to build that sensibility and connected and be able, I think importantly, to see like the endpoint, right? The closer we can bring our developers to the merchant or our end user, build that empathy. And I think like to thread the needle here about like the relationship, be really aware of the relationship and the outcomes we're trying to achieve for our merchants. We're already like steps ahead of any like checklist. That's just my feeling on it.
Thank you. And what I liked is that you brought in the how-to with developers, the culture, but also governance, which we'll come back to, because you're looking at governance at a broader level in terms of your working group. Over to Florian.
So I think I have like 2 hours, right, to offer some thoughts as a reflection. No, like so sadly, for the audience, you missed my faces when everybody were like making the introduction. I was like in agreement or saying like, oh yes, I have so much to say. So I agree with everything that has been said. And I think, Wendy just used the word like culture. And I think this is one of the key words when we think about trust, and the culture within industry, within society, and also like within government. I know, and Vara was also like mentioning some of the regulatory, perspective. Some would say that maybe regulatory hesitancy when in Canada, like often the constitution is used as a very good excuse of, oh, we can't do anything, or like, oh, we would like stifle innovation, but like, what kind of innovation are we talking about? Like responsible innovation is not stifled by privacy rules, etc. So that there is like different kind of cultures that come to play when we discuss trust in AI, in technology, and even like trust in government. And just looking at the state of the privacy in Canada, that was like lagging behind even before AI came to become like a major player of everyday's life. Everybody agrees on this, academia, public sector, private sector, like we need an update. So Quebec went through it. Canada, don't get me started, but yeah, and so like maybe certification may be something in the waiting, but we also need to be careful about the checkbox. What Wendy said, and that's something that we've seen a lot lately in privacy. The kind of the move toward like just compliance. And our colleague Ari Wallman from Northeastern published a book last fall, Industry Inbound, or like 4 years. He went to do like interviews in some of the big technological companies in the US. How they thinking about privacy in social media, in AI, etc. Just like they had a checklist developed by legal, and they just need to like check this without thinking of anything else. Just, oh, we can click that button. And I think what Wendy mentioned about the culture and working together. Like often in industries, you have legal on one side, you have like data science on the other side, the developers, and at some point you have someone who's gonna like deploy it to the end users, and those people don't communicate together. So I think it's important, and when for the developers to think of the endpoint, and like to what is going to be used, how, etc. And I think that's one of the key elements in developing those kind of frameworks.
Thank you, Florian. Amy? You're in charge of a very interesting team. You brought up the whole kind of chain of activities, if you will, or the chain of events or the production line, whichever term you want to give it, in terms of where all the multiple decisions have to be. You talked about co-creation and you talked about trusted relationships within. But at the same time, you, just like Wendy is all the private sector all over the world, you're governments at all levels in Canada. But for you to talk about perhaps just, the province of Ontario, which is where your responsibilities lie, they're good. It's nice to focus a little bit in one area. Can you tell us a little bit about the governance of that? Because in a way, governments procure AI services and technologies. You don't necessarily build things in-house, you procure things. So how do you ensure that they're, all across government of Ontario, that you can ensure that there is, that the different branches who may procure some kind of artificial intelligence or machine learning system or some kind of automated system follow the guidelines or the principles, or actually embrace the culture that you were talking about? Can you tell us a little bit about those challenges and how that works?
Sure. So I'm going to talk about the whole province and
everything.
No worries. Of course, Tracy. Sure. Tuesday morning. Everyone has mentioned a lot of, and this is why I always love, because it's like everybody has a different perspective, but we all come to the same sort of details as we move forward. And really it is the people and how they come together. So as Wendy had mentioned, that starting with a checklist, it is sort of the beginning, and you don't want the checklist to become the action. You want it to start, hopefully, a whole chain reaction of actions and a new way of thinking and talking and approaching the issue. And I like where Florian was going with the end user. Both, I think a few people talked about like that end use and having people connected. But what I've also seen within this pandemic is it's important to understand not everyone is looking at the same outcome. And everyone talks about the end user, the end outcome, as though it's a singularity, as though it's like we're all working towards this one great thing. And that's not the case. That everybody's working and everybody is excited about a facet of the end state, a piece of the outcome. One of the ripples is what I'm really excited about. Wendy's excited about another ripple, and a developer is excited about another ripple. So I think there's also, like I said, there's all these sort of micro transactions and these micro opportunities to build trust along the way. And that's sort of where I think this sort of connection, and even though we're procuring a lot of solutions or ways forward, it still is about how we use it and why we use it. And are we using this or creating this to what end? And I think that a lot of folks rush past to the end, and we all know why we're doing this, right? You all know who these are, that people don't take the time to unpack. And I find that that's where a lot of really important discussions and as we were alluding to with those checklists, that you want to make room for everybody. You want to make sure that these discussions, these aha moments, these pivots happen when they're supposed to, when they should, to reach whatever your outcome is. And if it is the greater good, well, then what is each one of us? Because the developer wants a happy, easy experience, maybe for the person, maybe the policy writer or the program deliverer wants to make sure the money gets to the right recipients, and then there's the compliance pieces. So governance needs to take into account all of the outcomes, not just the one that we all see in front of us, because in our head, we're all seeing a different one. And I know during the pandemic, when we were opening data, that was a big piece, is that trying to get everybody along the chain to understand that we have aligned goals, that we all want to, in, let's say, opening the COVID data, for instance, during a pandemic. Don't worry, comms. There is a good spin to this. There's a good reason, that people like, don't worry, data. Yes, there is going to be data quality issues, but this is our opportunity to have data literacy discussions. Why does this data not match that data? Excellent. Now the execs are going to have to learn a little bit about how this. There is opportunity. There are wins here, and they might seem small depending on your perspective. But if you take a moment to connect with someone, you'll understand that there's actually some huge wins that are here. So I think it's also aligning what is the outcome that we're all excited for, taking the time to hear what everyone's excited for, taking the time to hear what they're not excited for, what they're worried about, because that's where trust building is. It can't just be we all get in a room and we're all super excited, we're all saying the same thing, we all want to do the same thing. If there's no one dissenting, and someone's either not speaking up or someone's not here. And so how do you move that forward? Because that's how you build trust as well. If everyone's just agreeing with you, are they too scared to tell you that they disagree? So I think that coming to that trusted and being trustworthy, that was started at the beginning. So I will step down, and hopefully that answered some of your question.
That's great. And so what you're saying is that you need to have an environment within government to have critical, complicated conversations about a variety of issues, and also healthy debates about what these issues, and an assumption for, at least for citizens, to understand that the people who are working in government, politicians are a different thing for me, but the people like yourself who are working in government actually are trying as best as possible within the constraints that you have to be responsible actors. Afterwards, what I'd like to do is I'd like to maybe come back, Amy, with your open partnership government commitments on AI. So let's not forget that. I'm going to move over to you, Var. You talk about a certification. So tell us about certification, and in the context of what Wendy, Florian, and Amy talked about. And after that intervention, I'm going to go to one of the questions that we have. So the floor is over to you. And like everybody else, Var, because you're an association that's responsibility over AI, is responsibility over all the world, everywhere on the work that you're doing.
Okay, so I think so. We have some agreed upon principles at I guess principles and guidelines for responsible AI and AI ethics that cover the whole world, and I think that is great. That that many countries around the world have been able to come to some sort of consensus on that. But regulators have not really been on the same page around the world in how to translate those guidelines and principles into laws, and that's of course to be expected, especially given different political systems. In the EU, you might have a bigger role for regulators. In the US, you might have a bigger role for courts, with Canada falling somewhere in between. But what we're seeing is that organizations need guidance now, since they're adopting AI systems now. And also we should recognize that even if regulators were on the same page, AI is kind of nebulous. AI use cases are very different from each other. So when you're looking at something like automated video job interviews, that's very different from something like automated financial product suggestions. So our organization's stance is that certification programs and kind of private governance mechanisms are can provide value in a situation where there's a variety of use cases and regulatory uncertainty. And certification programs can occur kind of at the process level, which is which already there's already a lot of process-based certifications for business and for technology. And they of course need an AI layer on top of them to be relevant to AI systems. And there's also product based. So this is like a certification of the actual AI system itself. And our emphasis is more on the product side, which is why we're focused on specific use cases. And so, I mentioned that we have an implementation framework. We have a repeatable process to calibrate that implementation framework to different use cases, so that we're kind of gauging risks, the specific risks of the different use cases differently. And then we also have kind of like the a guidance on the sorts of tools and processes you would need to support the implementation of responsible development of AI for a specific use case. So these are like checklists, assessments, roles and responsibilities. And it is of course tough to tackle that culture piece, because it's kind of like a feedback loop. So you need like leadership buy-in, people who want to do the right thing, and then you also need these sorts of multi-layered tools and processes and policies, and then those two kind of build on each other. So So yeah, so that's a bit about our approach to certification, and then maybe the last thing I'll say about that is we're also trying to make sure that we're co-creating and engaging with the community. So we have responsible AI working groups for AI and HR and for AI and lending and collections, and those have kind of representatives from academia, from government, from industry, and from consulting firms. And so we try to look at the issue from various different perspectives.
Thank you very much. I'm just waiting for the question to be posted back, David's question to be posted back in the chat, because suddenly I lost visuals on it. So hopefully it will come back. So stay tuned, David. And Fadi, I will get to your question as well. What I really liked about what you were saying, Var, and I think it's something that's common everywhere, is universalism versus particularism, right? That all regulation and all certification applies to all AI and machine learning all the time. But yet context is very important. You also brought in the temporal component. And so as we're waiting for legislation, we still need something to govern in between. So having said that, I'll come back to you, Florian, and then I'll come back to David's question, just on that point, because you were very strong earlier on that guidelines are not enough. But in the absence of law and regulation, what ought we do in the interim?
No, for sure. Like, and it takes. Sorry. Yeah. No. I know. How to solve all this with law? So I do believe that law will not be the solution to everything. We cannot regulate everything. So first, I don't think that we can regulate technology. So it could be like an AI act. I'm like, yes, but even when you look at the draft, it's not so much about AI, but behaviors, and uses of technology. And I think this is essential, because every time that a government and any government try to regulate a technology, by the time it passes all the levels, the technology is like way beyond, and we just cannot apply this. And this is what happened in the 90s, because we had developed all our legal frameworks with one technology in mind: paper. And then we moved we digitalize everything, and like, oh, can't work anymore. We need to rethink stuff. And sometimes we just recreated the same framework just for a specific digital technology. And other time we had a more like functional approach, like take neutral vis-a-vis the technology, to make sure that we regulate the behaviors, some usage, rather than the technology, which I think is the maybe the right solution. But that's principle based, and then it's ought to work with. And this is when, like, something that Amy mentioned earlier, the need to not think about just one person and to include people in the conversation. Also, Wendy was mentioning workshop, and like when you think of responsible technology development, you need to have everybody around the table. But so it's the field, but it's also like everybody in society. This is where like you need to develop an inclusive workspace within industry, within government, within parliament. You need to have representation. Representation matters more than anything else, like when you think about technological development. And by the way, kudos, I'm the only white cis dude on this panel, and this is lovely, because there is a lot of white cis dude talking about this. Usually, it's only this, and it's very strange how the conversation change and shift when you bring other voices to discuss the use of a technology. Even within the development teams, when you have more women in the development team, in the engineering team, it's weird. The uses and what people are discussing around the table changes. So I think it's very important also, but the processes, and Paul touched upon this, you need also to have the proper processes within governments, within the industry, for some people maybe to be able to blow the whistle when there is an issue, when they've been trying to bring an issue to the table, they will not listen, or they see that something is very wrong or could have like enormous adverse effect, and then they cannot do anything. And this is another file like close to my heart, is the protection of whistleblowers and security researchers around the world, but especially in Canada. This is unbelievable. We don't protect them. And one of my arguments lately, and we're discussing before the the talk about like my sabbatical next year is that will be the project is the interface, responsible AI and information security research is like, ethical guidelines, they may work, sometimes they don't. Legal framework, they work, but there is an informational asymmetry. So one way maybe to solve this is to make sure that when you have people inside government, inside industry that can like blow the whistle if something bad is about to happen, that they're protected. They can come forward with proper processes. You cannot allow everything because there's trade secrets at play and stuff, but we need to think about this. And that's my last one maybe. So environment, regulation, it's so important. So behaviors, etc. And we try to develop some new concepts, both in the directive on automated decision making for the government. We're like, big kudos for the team. I was so sad when they all left the government. I'm like, oh my God, no, we had competent people in the room. But hopefully, the legacy is still well alive within government. But when we mentioned the right to explanation, and I will finish on this, that is often talked about as like the solution to everything. I'm like, it might be good. Also with the privacy, like the impact assessment might be good because it brings documentation, it forces people to think about this. But right to explanation to whom? About what? Like it's sometimes kind of the right of explanation is actually working against citizens because it's kind of an information, like all overload. We just transfer the risk on them. Well, you should have known, wow, this is how we did this, and you cannot understand. This is what happened with privacy, Oh yes, lawyers, they love to put very long term of uses, like all those long contracts. And I know I'm a law professor, but I always criticize this. They will come to the engineers, oh, we need this, we need this, we need that. Then nobody can read it, but they're very happy because they have, covered all like liability risk. But for the end users, it's awful. And so it's kind of like plays against people, the idea of consent in privacy. Yeah, it matters if you can actually communicate the correct information to the user. And so that's kind of the thing I want, all the things that's come with the right to explanation, but I don't think it should be the only like safeguards. Because also when you see and we're discussing this with my colleague Teresa Scassa, with one of the thought leader on privacy, on AI, etc. So the former C11 for the previous government, had that kind of right to an explanation, but basically for everything, even for suggestion, and so now we can just write to Amazon and stuff so how did you promoted this new book? I'm like, that can be kind of a nightmare on both ends. Maybe we need guidelines to see what they're gonna have to disclose, and this is where the certification programs might be interesting, to protect the citizens, to have actual expert who can understand this, going through that information. And this is what we did at the beginning of privacy and information security. We have developed those kind of certification because most people, they don't have the tech literacy to do this. Even government agencies, when you look at the portal for whistleblowers, we don't have that tech literacy in most governmental agencies. So should we really expect any kind of citizen in rural Canada, or even in downtown Ottawa, to understand this? I don't think so. So sorry, that was my comments. I agree with everybody and wanted to reinforce those points.
It's a very interesting and exciting topic. Thank you. I'm going to go to the questions, but what I don't want to forget is I don't want to forget the idea of governance, the idea of mixed teams, because I think that's very important. I know that when I speak to data science students, it's always about the science and the formula. And often there's a missing of this idea of teams and and laws, because if they, the idea of objectivity always comes down to the math, but there is more to it than that. And I was also thinking of Joy Bulyawami's work in particular with regards to facial recognition and people who are Black in the United States. I also want to come back to some of the things that you said, Florian, with the European Union General Data Protection Regulation, for example, the right to explanation, because that's where it stems from, and then it shows up into Bill C11, but also the idea of certification, because perhaps as an interim, for perhaps someone in a government like the government of Ontario, where we can't expect all the people who are going to procure technologies and hire people who can do things. Certification is maybe one way to enable those who purchase technologies to be able to make informed decisions. But then afterwards, VAR, I would come back to you. So I'm asking you to remember all of these things that I'm going to forget. That's what I'm asking you. And then when we come back to you, VAR, the idea of, well, who verifies the certifiers to ensure that certification actually makes sense at the end of the day. Whew. Okay, now that I've gotten all of that off my chest, I'm going over to David's question. So let's not forget that thread if we can. We have two other questions after that. So from David McNichol, I believe was his last name. I don't see the thread here, so if I got it wrong, please forgive me. The question is this: assertion. The rule of law in Canada crushes Earth system science. So that could be, hydrological cycles or climate change or Earth observation systems, part of big picture externalization for reasons of political power, for example, in a question mark. So, for example, the Ottawa River has 35 dams, but no ongoing data. So I'm not sure where we're completely going with that question. Who would like to take it on? I think it's about not having enough data to do things and a concern that maybe over-regulation will limit the amount of data that comes in this case on Earth observation systems. I hear the pin drop. Nobody wants to take it on. Oh, way to go. Is that you, Amy?
I'll try around this.
Yeah, great.
For these big pieces, especially in earth sciences, I mean, data collection, for a couple of years isn't helpful. So I think you're saying like you need that long term. Like I know where our terabytes of data are, and they're not in finance. They're in MNDM and environment and mining and soils and stuff. That's where the big data is. So I think that's where you're getting around and how data is collected. Now, I'm not sure around like that piece, Tracy, about what is regulated is often where the data is, because that's where, well, I have to collect this data because it is in this piece of legislation or regulation, like a nutrient management, like that in that piece of ridiculously written legislation, like it's huge, poor farmers, but like it has a lot of data that it has to be collected, has to be stored. It doesn't say what we have to do with it, but sometimes regulation is where the data collection will come in. So I would just put the pin in that. But I think what they're saying, that what type of data and over long periods of time and who's responsible for it over long periods of time, I see that political question mark sort of piece, because it does get murky over decades. Like if we're looking at like soils data in Ontario, like, I mean, that we're relying on, I think, like the original survey data still to do most of our land use planning, right? So I think that's where it's coming in. And how do we collect more data? For some of this data, that's a huge undertaking, a lot of money and a lot of time. So how do you get that longevity over time, I think is what maybe we're pulling at with David's question. And so I think that's where I'm excited by things like the crowdsourcing and not just breaking down silos within an organization, but between. So how do we, but we look at weather data out of the states and stuff like that, like how do we create large collections or puddles or whatever, the lakes or the different terms that change over time. But I think that's just it, things change over time. How do you get the standards? How do you get things in place to allow long-term data collection for big picture thinking like climate change? And I think that that's very interesting. And AI definitely comes into this space. How do we fill in the gaps? How do we bridge different standards over time? I think there's a lot of interesting questions there. And again, it's looking towards that. Why are we doing this? That changes over time and on someone's perspective. So if we are going to try to maintain huge sets of data, who's going to care for them, who's going to control the access, who's going to control the possession, because I know if the United States is where they're looking at that weather data, if that suddenly falls into private data and no longer just available for everyone because now they've woken up to how valuable it is, that will crash so many apps and so much of our knowledge. Look at when the planes stopped flying and we stopped collecting weather data. All of a sudden in 2020, we didn't know what our forecast, whether we could trust it anymore. So there's a lot of pieces that we don't even understand where the data is coming from. And I think that David raises a good point for these big picture thinking. who is responsible for it? And if you do just take a little slice and you're just looking at the Ottawa River, you're just looking at this, and you've made a piece of legislation or regulation that's just about the green belt in Ontario, are we missing an opportunity to build out better evidence for future thinking, long-term thinking, beyond the political cycle thinking? And I think that's another one of these pieces that over the last couple of years, not just equity and who's inclusion and who's missing from the table, but also who is responsible? Aren't we all responsible? How do we bridge this idea of governance for long-term, not just Ontario, not just Canada, but our wider value as a planet or as a global community? Because that's, I think, what David's digging at here.
Thank you very much, Amy. That's an excellent response to it. And I very much appreciate the global framework, the local and the global, and the shifting between different scales. And also, you remind me of an important book by Paul Edwards called A Vast Machine, which talks really about the global infrastructure of climate change data and climatological and weather data, which is very interesting because we get the weather every day locally, but it's part of a mass global Internet of Things system of systems that has been in place for about 150 years. But also the weather system is where we get the original open data, because it was the meteorologists who lobbied first to open data and to come up with some standards. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to go over to a question from Fadi. Fadi's question is, so my question is, how can AI ethics be effective in a silos-based culture? Now, Wendy, can I come back to you on that? Not that you spoke about silos in any which way, but because you are in an organization and quite a large organization, perhaps you can tease a little bit of this out for us.
I'm not sure I understand the core of the question, but I'll try and get there. If I think of like data silos from an access perspective, it's different from, I think, what I was talking about creating a culture of approach to how these solutions like can be built, right? So data silos, as I look further down, like the Q&As, I think that the questioner is talking about how you share data across departments or different applications in order to create aggregate benefit in general. From a production use case, if you want to like build applications that share data, typically for commercial applications, it's opt-in, right? So you can build strategically with opt-in opportunities for like your end user to agree to the sharing of data. And typically in those opt-in situations, it's very clear what the benefit is to the end user of having data in aggregate, help them make more informed decisions. So I'm thinking of like fairly banal applications, like especially around recommendations or opportunities to leverage like things like industry classification for, when I'm thinking about other organizations I've worked in as well, like those kinds of like sharing of data inputs, like typically are opt-in solutions. But from a data siloing perspective, that would depend on the application. It shouldn't prevent the crucial conversations from happening within organizations on the how you approach these problems, right? Whether or not an application is built or is even like the end goal of those conversations, they're not, one does not prevent the other from happening, right? So maybe there's two parts of their question.
Thank you very much. Fadi, if you're not sure and if you're not happy for the response, add us more. But I thank you very much, Wendy, for that very thoughtful response. We now have a question from an old friend, Daryl Bridge from the city of Ottawa. His question is, how can you effectively communicate to the end clients how the AI works? For example, how decisions are made. How about I come over to you with this one, Var?
Yeah, so that's a tough one. I think it's part of that is based on the industry. So which there's already existing legal frameworks for many industries that kind of already do a risk analysis that's implicit in the regulations, and so the most important issues are the ones that you would want to address. In terms of more complicated AI systems, or maybe where you don't have that much guidance, there's a couple of strategies. One is testing. So just talk to as many people as you can with different backgrounds and ask them what they want to know, and how, and kind of compare those responses and do your best with what you think would be helpful for them. The other one is to do a harms mapping and think about the ways in which people could be impacted, and do kind of an analysis of those harms yourself, and try to mitigate the ones that, the biggest magnitude, or the ones that are easiest to mitigate. So those are kind of two approaches, but again, there's no real neat answer to the question.
Thanks very much. I'm going to go over to a question from Kazi, and I'm going to pose this question over to you, Florian. So the question is, who's responsible for AI's mistakes? No pressure.
That's another tough one.
Yes.
I would say, like, and I will, my answer will be like the usual one for, from law, is like, it depends. But like, it depends, like, what kind of system are we talking about? What is, the context of the deployment? What kind of mistake? What is it coming from? Is it due to the deployment of the system, due to the development of the system? So like the question of liability when something bad happened with AI, and we need to think about this, because it's not just that AI is bad. There is always something bad that's going to happen. That's why we have developed, legal frameworks, because, at some point something bad will happen. So it depends, but something to keep in mind is someone will always be liable. It may take some time, like for anything, when there is a car crash, like who is going to be, is it the driver? Is it the manufacturer? It depends where the issue lies. So this is the same kind of inquiries that's going to be needed for AI, that might be more complex, because an AI algorithm might be more complex than a car, and some now like AI is within a car. But yeah, it will really like depends on who is the origin, but it will never be the AI. And maybe that would be my something that I thought of, when I saw that question in the Q&A. There is a group of people for like a few years, but it's not new to AI. Like since the 90s, who have been arguing for a legal personhood for AI. Right. And I'm strongly against this, and I'm going to try to unpack very quickly why. It's a social justice issue. Most people pro AI legal personhood are from industry. Why? Because if you give personhood to someone or something, they become the one liable, and the other people are not liable. That's why we have created corporations. The legal persons as corporation have been created with that purpose in mind. Because so you have a corporation, and usually they're going to be liable. They're going to be limited liability, like organizations. And so if something goes bad, it's like the organization itself and not the people, not the executives. Although like sometimes we saw that it might be abused. So we have developed mechanism at law to like unveil this, this limited liability framework. And what people are trying to do, so some authors and some like thought leaders, maybe the quotes on that point, in my opinion, in industry, is to have what we did for corporations, but without the option to unveil and like remove that limited liability framework. They just want the AI to be liable, which is an issue. And they're like, oh, but sometime the AI may decide by itself, the developer will not know. That's not a lie, but that's untrue. So first thing first, the same people also, do press release about Sophia, that humanoid that was like the human thinking. No, Sophia was like just a press stunt by industry. Like the super intelligence doesn't exist. No, like some algorithms are like very good at very specific tasks, but an AI, and maybe we could unpack even what AI is. That's a big question. That could do like everything like a human being, doesn't exist yet. And we don't know. Maybe it will exist. We don't know, but like it's not in the 5, 10 next years. No, we need to look at the issue at the moment. Right now at Law, we have a very good framework that has been working for 4 years since the 90s, which is the framework of agency. And we have been contracting with computers and with AI and with machine for years. Like, when is even the last time that you actually sign a contract with a human person? Or you sign it with a machine? Or every time that you order on Amazon and before that eBay and stuff, it's like you contract with an AI, with a machine. And so we developed the agency framework that's working quite well. Yes, sometimes the AI will do something bad, you'll be liable. But the agency framework has been developed in law way before AI and technology. It was developed for humans. So if an employer can be held liable for the action of a human being, and there is nothing more unpredictable than a human, I think that they should be able to manage an AI that they choose to rely on, that they set up. And then if they did the procurement, if they did the bad job at the procurement, well, they should be the one liable, not that AI that has no patrimony, nothing to compensate the victims of their actions. So that's sorry, I was a bit long, but this is something I care a lot about because, in my opinion, it's a social justice issue. And if we want to have trust, in the deployment of AI, we need to make sure that people who make those decisions will be held accountable and legally liable if something goes bad. Because without this, there will be no trust. Because citizens will be okay, if something bad happened, there will be no consequences. So I think to go back to trust, I think that's a key element, in my opinion, of trustworthy deployment of AI.
Thank you. Thanks for bringing up the idea of inscrutability as well. And you also remind me of a very important statistical scholar called Theodore Porter, who talks about management at a distance. So it's the idea that you let the numbers manage. It's not my responsibility. It's the numbers' fault. It's not my fault. It's the AI's fault. It's an extension of that, and that actually doesn't hold water, that there has to be a responsible actor. So thank you very much for that question and for that response, Florian. Now a question from Alexander, and then there will be one more question after that from Anna, because we're at 10:47, and I wanted to give us some time to wrap up a little bit at the end. And I'm going to kind of reframe your question a little bit, Alexander, or I'm going to ask whoever's going to answer it to keep it within the context of trust, so that we stay, that we don't waver too far away from what the panel was about. So the question is this: ethics here seems to be mostly about not harming people, from avoiding total extinction of humans by AI actions, to offending someone's sensibilities. But not harming one person or company can harm another. How is that usually resolved? So who would like to take that one on? This is where I go t t t t t t t t t t t t t. Am I going to assign it? VAR, you're it.
Okay. Yeah, so I think that this is where I fall upon my lawyer instincts. The companies already know who they are responsible to, and of course that's a big evolving conversation as well. A lot of companies now see themselves as responsible to stakeholders. They're always responsible to the government. They have a reputation to maintain with their customers. And then they're also, of course, responsible to their stakeholders and their legal duties that in tort that they kind of have to fulfill. So I think that in terms of like the broader question here, which is about like how do you think of ethics? Is it just a cost benefit analysis, and how do you allocate then who's benefits and who's harmed? I think that firstly, I think that it's important to have a positive vision of AI, because it's not like, yeah, we do focus on harms a lot, and it's kind of, it's our job to focus on harms and think about harms and how to distribute harms. But AI can also personalize service delivery, and so if you have something like, going back to the government context, something like delivery of government services in an accessible manner that can be personalized by a person, it might be really useful for like language or color or button size for a form, or the ability to easily reuse an earlier form, or to responsibly use a biometric security feature to verify your identity if you live in a remote area, where there are no government services available otherwise. Those sorts of things are kind of, I guess what I'm getting at is to think beyond just this is not a zero-sum game where you're distributing harms. There's also plenty of gains to be achieved if you adopt this technology responsibly, and so responsibly and thoughtfully. So that's the other kind of angle to the question that I would encourage.
Thank you very much, Var. Oh, Florian's got his hands
Yeah,
up. Florian, like me.
I just need to. Sorry, I just need a few minutes to think about this question, to answer it maybe in a nicer way than my initial reaction, and maybe I will use an example. So when we haven't discussed AI in healthcare, and this is where it's being deployed at the moment, and there is a huge trust issue, and so I'm part of a group of scholars working with people in hospital, technology developers in Montreal, but also patients. Making sure everybody around the table to discuss this, and to flip, Alexander's question, and also sometimes an AI deployment is very good for some people, but very bad for others. We need to think about this, and I think it's Amy was mentioning some things that we saw with COVID at the beginning for data and training AI. This is something like the access of data to develop, and deploy AI in healthcare is an issue, because we have some concept in privacy law, like only specific kind of data can be, collected. If you need to explain, what data you need, why. And at the beginning of COVID, we had no idea whatsoever what that illness was. So basically, we had to collect, researchers, if they wanted to develop models, they had to collect all the data in the world, because anything could be a symptom. And 2 years later, I feel like almost every week we're oh, this actually could be a symptom. Anything could be a symptom. So this is a case where we saw that maybe legal framework were not fully adapted, and also the division between Quebec and Ontario, and then the federal for the hospital, for the actors, that became a nightmare for people to actually be able to tackle that global pandemic around the world, but especially in Canada. So this is things that we need to think of, but we cannot stop something sometime because there is gonna be one bad use, or stop allow something just because maybe could be useful or beneficial for society. And this is what all the people around the table today are working on, is how to find the right balance. How can we develop the correct framework, either within the law or just within practice, because we need a lot of goodwill. And even with the best pieces of legislation, if we don't have the goodwill of industry, of practitioners, it will not work. That's why we have court that people are getting sued every day, because law is not gonna be the solution to everything. But so we need to think of both sides, and this is why it's complex. And yeah, why we need to have those kind of events, to have those kind of conversations.
Thank you. So tempering technological solutionism and enthusiasm, and overemphasis on innovation, and thinking through culture and society more broadly as those decisions are made. So very interesting. Thank you, Florian. We have one last question, and I'm going to ask all of you one after another, and I'll start with Var, and I'll go back and I'll end from the very beginning and where we started. And I'd like you to think, maybe in your case, Var, when you answer this question, think about certification. Florian, if you can think about legislation and that kind of framework. Amy, if you can think maybe about the commitment in the Open Government Partnership. And Wendy, if you can think about the role of industry and the teams that you are working with when you respond to this question. And of course, bring it back to trust. So at the end of the day, we're going to bring it home to trust. We have 6 minutes left, so let's do it. So that means I'm gonna wrap things up as you go along. So the question from Anna, from the School of Journalism and Communication, is this: How do you, in your line of work, make sure to take the broader social, political, and ethical contexts into account in which your data practices and products, et cetera, are built, deployed, and used? Is this something that you hold yourself accountable for? Over to you, Var.
Yeah. So in terms of, I think the social, the broader social, and I guess I might lump into that like ESG, environmental and social good aspects of the work that as it relates to responsible AI. A lot of what we do is kind of built upon when working with member organizations to make sure that their systems and processes are conducive toward responsible AI. We first do an inventory of their existing kind of their existing ESG diversity and stakeholder engagement during product development, their compliance with various data protection laws, and potentially going the extra mile in that. And so not everything we do is kind of with just the AI piece in mind. There are like really fundamental building blocks that you just want to make sure that you have in place to make sure that everything works together well. As for, do we hold ourselves accountable to it? Yes, we do. I'm not sure like which aspect of that to focus on, but in terms of like ESG and diversity and those sorts of things, we definitely hold ourselves accountable as well.
Thank you very much. Over to you, Wendy.
Yeah, I was thinking about this one like quite a bit as well. So I'll say like, how do we make sure to take the broader social, political, and ethical context into account when we're building solutions? This to me is anchored in having diverse teams, both of like representation and thought. Like that's the critical component. I know we only have a couple of minutes, so I'll say that is a prerequisite to getting to like the fuller answer. Is something you hold yourself accountable to. I think is like a bit of a misframing of how industry and teams hold themselves like accountable to the products they build and deliver to your end users. So I'll say the accountability we hold is around continuous improvement from both qualitative as well as quantitative means. We understand how our users are using our end products, like what the impact of those products are on the outcome we're trying to achieve, and observing that and building forward to give them better outcomes for ourselves. So accountability is like implicit in our practice, and diversity is our anchor.
Thank you very much. Over to you, Florian. And then we're going to bring it home with the last word for you, Amy.
So like in my everyday work, yeah, this is something I held myself accountable. And even though, I may check some of the boxes of the usual, diversity grid, like I'm still a white cis dude, and I'm, just making like, acknowledging that I'm a white cis dude in my work, in my perspective, in my origin, and that even like when you discuss immigration, that, so I went through the process, but like with a PhD from a Canadian university, like speaking French, bonus point, very easy for me, and still it was a nightmare. So I acknowledge those kind of things, and it's so important the way I compose my research team, of student, of postdoc, etc. It's essential for the events, etc.
Merci, Florian, and thank you for your reflexivity, Amy.
Yeah, echoing all of the pieces that everyone's brought together here. And that's where I do lean on those open government roots. And as you mentioned, our commitments, which this year were to continue to co-create guidance out with the public. And that's where it isn't just enough for my team to say that's our job. We are always working to connect people, to widen their gaze, to widen the conversation. But it's important as a government to have that visibility. It's not enough for me. I showed you the checkbox. Yes, my team has all considered it, but to show you and to allow you constant access when you need it, like things like the Open Government Partnership, where you can come and peek in on us when it's important to you.
Thank you very much, everybody. This is the end of our session. This was very engaging and very exciting. I wish we had 3 more hours and we could do this at a restaurant with some coffees and some wine, but we cannot. I wish you all a wonderful continuation of your day. Var, Florian, Wendy, and Amy, thank you very much for providing your generous time and your tremendous insight on this very important topic of trust and AI. Good day, everybody.